Old time religion, give me that. Old time religion, give me that. Old time religion, and it's good enough for me.
What are the chances of seeing you here? Have you ever thought about all of the connections necessary in the past for the present to be as it is? In the year 2022, we are downstream of a nearly infinite series of causes and effects that have given us the world as we know it. Change just a minor detail or two of even ancient history, and who can tell how different our world would be today? What if Alexander the Great had not died at 32? What if Abraham Lincoln had been at church on the night of Good Friday instead of at Ford's Theater? These speculations are intriguing, but their answers can never be more than open-ended theories. They also feel detached from our personal stories. In the book of Ruth, there was a wealthy and unmarried man named Boaz, who owned property near Bethlehem. There was also a young woman from the nation of Moab named Ruth. The Moabites had descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew, making the people of Judah and the people of Moab distant cousins. There was ongoing animosity between the two nations. But when famine came to Judah, Moab was a land of opportunity that tempted at least one family from Judah to travel east in search of food. While these refugees were in Moab, the father died. The sons also died, but not before finding wives from among the local girls. One of these girls was Ruth, who became deeply attached to her mother-in-law Naomi. After her husband's death, and after things improved in Judah, Ruth left the land of her birth in order to remain with Naomi and Naomi's God. The whole city of Bethlehem welcomed the two widows when they returned, but they remained widows with no means of support. Centuries before, when God had given the law to Moses, he had made provision for the poor of the land. He told Israel that when they gathered their harvests, they were not to reap the corners of their fields, or go back to pick up grain that had fallen. Following this command gave those who did not have their own fields the opportunity to gather food to survive. Since the two women had arrived back home at the beginning of the barley harvest, Ruth asked Naomi if she might go out one day to gather up some of this fallen grain. The pivotal moment in the story comes in Ruth 2:3, which is my favorite verse in the book. We read there that she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. God is sovereign over all of creation, and yet the book literally says that Ruth just happened to end up in Boaz's field. Those who know this short story know how it ends. The pieces quickly fall into place, and Ruth, the Moabite widow, becomes the well-provided-for wife of Boaz, great-grandmother to King David, and ancestress of King Jesus. What divinely orchestrated circumstances led her to that specific field that day? Was it the closest one? The one with the most shade? Or the one with the most abundant crop? Later verses show that Naomi knew who Boaz was, and of his marriageable state, but they also show that she did not know where Ruth was working that day until she returned that evening. Yet something prompted Ruth to head in the direction of his barley field. If she had ended up in a different field, how might history have been changed? Would Boaz have ever married? Without Ruth, we don't get King David. At least, we get a different kind of King David. Each of us descends from a long line of ancestors. Consider the fact that for every generation you go back in time, the number of your ancestors doubles. You have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, but you have 16 great-great-grandparents. Go back 10 generations, and you have just over 1,000. If only one of those 512 couples doesn't meet, or if one of the spouses doesn't live long enough to give life to the next generation, you aren't born. What if my father, who is from Maryland, had not joined the Navy and been sent to Chicago for training? And what if my mother, who is from Minnesota, had not gone to Chicago for college and stayed as a teacher? If any detail of their lives had kept one of them from being in Northern Illinois at the same time, you wouldn't be listening to my voice. Today, I'd like to go a little further back in time to share the story of my 4th great-grandmother, who, thankfully, wasn't a widowed Moabite, but who shares that Moabite's name. I've always enjoyed studying genealogy, even though it took me a long time to remember how to spell it. Studying and adding branches to a family tree is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without the picture. You have to put the pieces together in order to see what the picture looks like. And the more pieces you have, the more interesting the picture becomes. I've never looked into my family's past in the hopes of finding a famous ancestor. The thing that I find most interesting is to see how my predecessors fit into the larger picture of history. As a child, I learned about William Penn and the Quakers, but did not know until more recent years that I had many Quaker ancestors. I knew the story of the Statue of Liberty, but did not know that I had one grandmother, listed on the ship's registry as servant, who steamed from Sweden to England before passing under the shadow of Lady Liberty as she entered New York Harbor. I now read about the Quakers, late 19th century immigrants, and a host of other events in a way I never did before. Though Quakers first settled in Pennsylvania, it was not long before they began to migrate within the colonies. By the middle 1700s, there were numerous communities established in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Among the numbers that lived there were William Lupton and his wife and children. Their son Asa was born in 1757 and was married to his wife Hannah in 1787 at the Hopewell Monthly Meeting near Winchester. Before long, they had a small brood of children, including David, Edith, Hannah, Margaret, Ruth, and Anna. Asa and his family later moved 30 miles west into the mountains of what is today West Virginia. There they farmed and prospered enough to have land upon which another meeting house was built. It must have been an idyllic life, in the beautiful mountains, with fresh air to breathe and a family to raise. This is a typical view that we have of the old days, when things were safer. But one Sunday morning in 1805, a tragedy happened that shows us the past was not always as safe as we think it was. That morning, March 10, Asa, Hannah, and the older children went to meeting, and left Ruth, who was 8, in charge of Anna, 6, and a 3-year-old brother. This may sound odd, but the meeting house was very close, located on their own property. In sensationalized words typical of the day's reporting, the New York Evening Post tells us what happened at home while the parents and older children were at church. The article reads, "The doors of the dwelling house were all locked and bolted, and the children had been placed in the kitchen, which was connected to the house by a passage. Some time after those who went to meeting had left the house, a monster in the shape of a man, not more than 18 or 19 years of age, came into the kitchen and asked if all the family were absent except themselves. When the children said they were alone, after a short pause, he again repeated his question and received the same answer. He then walked out, went around the house, picked up an axe, with which he burst open the door of the house and entered it. He then burst open the door of one of the rooms and rummaged a desk of drawers. From there he proceeded to the door of the passage leading to the kitchen, which he opened. There he found the children, who, it is supposed, had been attracted by the noise in the house and had gathered to that spot. He then struck the boy on the head with the back of the axe, and after he fell, hit him again. This is the report of the oldest daughter, and her story matches with the evidence. The skull was fractured in 2 places, and some portion of the brain scattered around. It appears he then gave the oldest girl, Ruth, a blow. Her memory from this period is lost, which by some fortunate circumstance seems not to have affected as much as intended, although it laid her senseless for some time. The other girl was then knocked down, and her skull horribly fractured. The thing which caught the sight of the unhappy parents on their return was their oldest girl, who had recovered enough to crawl out of the house, and nearly fainting and trying to escape, had fallen repeatedly, and was a most dreadful sight, being smeared with blood and dirt. The parents then entered their recently peaceful home, and there discovered their 2 other darlings prostrate on the floor, near each other, almost covered with clotted blood and apparently lifeless. This was too much for human nature, and they left the house in indescribable agony. Even the neighbors were horrified, and it was some time before any could bring themselves to place the children's bodies on a bed. At this point they noticed some signs of life, and they quickly gave what medical help they could. The lives of the 2 youngest are despaired of. The eldest, it is hoped, may recover, being reserved perhaps by Providence for some special purpose. The name of the perpetrator of this abominable atrocity is Isaiah Martin. He was known by the oldest daughter because for some time they attended the same school. For the sake of humanity, it is hoped that enough evidence will be found to bring the perpetrator of this unheard of evil to punishment. This is a horrendous story, and not what we would expect to hear from the 1800s. It certainly had a profound effect on the family, and the trauma might well have contributed to the death of Asa the following year, and Hannah the year after that. The little boy died, but his two sisters survived. It is not known if Anne, the more severely injured of the two, survived to adulthood, but she was still alive at her mother's death 2 years later. Ruth, the eldest, lived to become a homesteading mother of several children and died in Iowa in her senior years. If my favorite verse in the book of Ruth tells of how she happened to come into the fields of Boaz, my favorite sentence in the newspaper article concludes with, "The eldest, it is hoped, may recover, being reserved perhaps by Providence for some special purpose." I do not know all of the special purposes for which Providence spared her life, but I do know that had she died when she was 8, I would not have been born. You may not be aware of similar stories in your own family's history, but rest assured that they exist. You are one link in a long, unbroken chain of lives. At the very least, if you are of European heritage, you are descended from someone from the half of Europe's population that didn't die of the Black Death in the 1300s. And we are all descended from Noah and his sons, the sole survivors of the Genesis flood. Does the past matter to you? Do you think that your existence is an accident of history? Or might I ask, what are the chances of seeing you here? Let us all thank God for his sovereign protection of the many people from the past upon whose survival our very existence depends.